This is about the refresh list for Norman MacCaig. The difference in the refresh list to the existing list that no longer is applicable is that they took out the two Francis MacCaig poems and put in their place two of the New York poems. And I had actually read them. I mean, I taught the New York poems, the two particular ones that are the giants, Hotel Room 12th Floor and Brooklyn Cop. But to be honest, I'd never studied the set. There were 9 poems written in that April 1966 when we went across to New York for this conference in Long Island. And I believe, and he actually probably, because he wasn't very rich, he didn't have a great deal of money, MacCaig. I suspect he got a hotel room in the Bowery, which was relatively cheap, quite notorious in 1966, but relatively cheap, and which is where I believe Hotel Room 12th Floor takes place, in the Bowery. It makes sense because there's references to other areas of the Bowery in that poem, which is another element about these New York poems. They are factual poems. There is very little, if anything, made up in those poems. Well, maybe the character of the Brooklyn Cop is maybe the fictional. The only fictional aspect of the set of 9 poems. And I say maybe because having studied, and I haven't the time in this video to go into it all, but having studied these 9 poems, I am more and more convinced that Hotel Room 12th Floor and Brooklyn Cop are married together and may well be talking about the same thing, this disturbance that happened outside his hotel room. But the 9 poems start off with a poem about the Long Island University conference that he had been invited across to in April 1966. He talks about Tugboat Poet. Tugboat Poet is a lyrical poem, and it's a really lovely lyrical poem, and in some ways marries with Hotel Room 12th Floor by way of contrast. Because both these poems, Hotel Room 12th Floor and Tugboat Poet, are about a noise that disturbed him and awoke him. The Tugboat Poet is about the sound of the poet, the tugboat pilot, taking his boat down the river and singing songs and making sounds to himself, and it's a pleasant sound. It's a sound that he enjoyed listening, and he may well not have gone up and watched it, but he must have known what it was, and he probably lay in bed listening to this sound, this harmonying sound about this tugboat pilot as he was going up the river. Compared, of course, to the sound outside his hotel room around the same time. Both happened around midnight, which clearly awoke him and disturbed him. Battery Park is at the bottom of Manhattan Island. It's an area for recreation. It's often used by New Yorkers who want a bit of a time out on their own, or indeed by Wall Street, which is just above Battery Park. And the workers in Wall Street quite often go into Battery Park for their lunches, etc. Circle Line is a poem about a trip that he took around New York Island, a normal trip, and he describes it. It's not a particularly important poem, except that it explains an element about what he did during this 2 weeks he was across in America. The Sun Comes to Earth in the Bowery is, I think, the closest poem I have read to Assisi. It's the same element of a focus on an individual. In this case, MacCaig used the term that he felt that he was insulted when certain things came when he viewed certain things, and seeing this person whom he describes in the poem, who could be drunk or he could be dead. It's not sure. MacCaig is ambiguous as to which of these two states this person is. And of course, the whole poem is that what is happening in the Bowery, which was a pretty difficult place to live in '66. The nature itself, the universe itself, comes with the Bowery to try and sort the matter out. It's a very much like an Assisi poem with a close focus on an individual. It's boxed, as in fact should Battery Park be boxed, because in 1988 MacCaig decided to edit his canon of poetry. And he decided that in that yellow book you may be familiar with, to edit out poems that he no longer felt he wanted published. Bowery and Battery Park are two from Rings on the Tree. And there are others. If you look at his poetry, I think anything up to 25% to 30% of the poetry was edited out in that 1988 edition. And it was continued in the 2005 edition. These poems are not back in the 2005 edition, even though I really do wish Sun Comes to Earth and the Bowery was put back in. It's such a wonderful poem about a theme that really did affect MacCaig and offended him. That was the word he wanted. It offended him to see this sort of thing happening in the middle of the day in New York, and the Bowery is just above the finance area of New York. It's just above that. In fact, if you're going down through the Bowery to Wall Street, you have to go through the Bowery. You have to go through that element of the Bowery, and you cannot miss it. So the people who worked in the exchange will have actually gone through it. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Some will have gone through it. You can't but go through it. And that was the state of the Bowery in '66. Leaving the Metropolitan Museum is not again one of the big important poems. It's an interesting poem, and it has a lovely poem, but it's not one of the important ones. And Last Night in New York is one which I think is a really good poem and well worth a bit of a study. And then, of course, there are the two giants, Hotel Room 12th Floor and Brooklyn Cop. And those are the 9 poems that he wrote in that April when he was across in New York. And I'm convinced they were all written in that time. Now, when he was across in New York, that conference, within one day, no more than 2 days, some American academic became aware that MacCaig was actually had rented a hotel room, and I'm sure it was the Bowery, because MacCaig was not a wealthy man, and he would not have been able to afford a very expensive hotel room. And I suspect it was in the Bowery, and it makes sense because of what happened in Hotel Room 12 and Brooklyn Cop. And that academic invited MacCaig to live with him and his family during the rest of his stay. So he was only in this hotel room for at maximum two nights, and maybe not even as much as that. Therefore, Hotel Room 12th Floor happened possibly on the first or at latest the second night he was in New York. Another element about these poems, I may have mentioned it, is they're factual. Aside from the Brooklyn Cop himself, everything is factual. There are references that I've now been able to pinpoint as we go through these poems. And so what I'm going to be doing in this is reflecting in some degree, not in any great detail. I haven't got the time to do that. It's all documented in the booklet about the New York poems and Hotel Room and Brooklyn Cop. This is a picture that you may well have seen. It's actually taken from the north of New York, of Manhattan Island, looking south. because the Pan Am building is not south of the Empire State Building, it's north of it. And if we look at this New York Island, though that star is where the Coldwater Flats were. There are two sets of Coldwater Flats, but the ones that were nearest the Bowery were between Canal Street and East Houston Street. And so that signals roughly where those Coldwater Flats are there. These were referenced in hotel room 12th floor. MacCaig said he heard screams, harsh screams from the hotel, from the Coldwater Flats. This is approximately where the Bowery area is. It could well actually extend slightly up, further up. There is the Empire State Building, and there is the Pan Am Building. So you can see it's north of the Empire State. So that picture looks to the north. This is another map trying to again focus on this whole area of the Bowery here, the Coldwater Flats here, the Wall Street area here in the blue, and finally Battery Park at the bottom. So the New York poems then. Well, the first thing I realized was just how close these poems were. The Bowery, the themes in the Bowery are reflected in 12th floor, hotel room 12th floor, and also in Brooklyn Cop. The idea of size is something which is relevant within the poems. It had been something which MacCaig had actually been well aware of and comments on a great deal. When he talks about the Coldwater Flats, as he does in hotel room 12th floor, these are flats that have no water, no running water at all. And this is a picture of such a flat. I'm not saying it's one from the Canal Street, but if the disturbance that he heard were what, and he's quite clear they came from the Coldwater Flats. He knows where these flats are. He knows where they are. He knows the direction of them. They're west of the Bowery, and clearly he knew about them, and he referenced them. And what happens there happens at the same time as is happening outside his hotel room. So it's a widespread disturbance. It wasn't just a small riot or whatever it was outside his hotel room. It spread across there. In Brooklyn Cop, he refers to Phoebe's Whamburger. Well, there are no pictures at the moment of the original Phoebe Whamburger that I could get hold of. This is the upgraded Phoebe's Whamburger, because it still exists, and it did exist, and it existed in the Bowery. It was in the Bowery, and what is important about Phoebe's Whamburger is that MacCaig will have eaten there. It's not just that he's gone past Phoebe's Whamburger, because he's gone up and down the Bowery or back to his flat or whatever it was, his hotel room. He knows it. Just as he knows about Louis' Place, which is also mentioned in Brooklyn Cop. Again, a hamburger joint, which both are in the Bowery. Both are referenced in the Brooklyn Cop. And what happens in the Brooklyn Cop is disturbances around the Whamburger and around Louis' Place. And I'm becoming more concerned and wondering whether in fact this was something that he was aware of, that what happened with the Brooklyn cop was related to what happened in hotel room 12th floor, and that in a sense you are seeing the other side of the picture. Hotel room 12th floor talks about the disturbers, the ones who created all the noise, etc., that woke him up. The Brooklyn cop is about those people who had to deal with this situation, and in the case of Brooklyn cop, it spread. It happened between these two places can be pinpointed in the Bowery, and it's well worth, if it's an exercise that you want to do, is pinpoint them on a New York map and see the breadth and the scope of this disturbance that this particular New York cop had to deal with. And because his hotel room had been in the Bowery, I'm convinced it was in the Bowery, that's just why the academic invited him to stay with him, because he was a famous Scottish poet, and in 1966 the Bowery wasn't the most attractive place to be in. So I could appreciate why he invited MacCaig to be with him and stay with his family. But it gives you an idea of this whole idea. And violence was the key theme out of the New York's visit in 1966, and repeated and recorded 1 year later when he returned to recite some of his poetry. And I don't believe he ever went back to New York after that. New York really did frighten him. This kind of social unrest that took place in New York, which is described in Hotel Room and in Brooklyn Cop, really did disturb him. And you have this wonderful comparison between the tugboat pilot sailing up and down the river, and the noises and the hoots that his thing was making, which are pleasant to the ear, something which MacCaig enjoyed listening to, and jarred so and contrasted so much with what had happened in the hotel room and in Brooklyn Cop. And of course, the other aspect was the contrast in New York. Battery Park, right at the end of Manhattan Island, which is what the picture is there, is a pleasure park. It's also linked to the ports for the boats, sailing for the tourist boats. But just above it, right up here with the red box in the top first picture, is Bowery. It's the Bowery. And the Bowery is very different from Battery Park. And they're all part and parcel of the same island. You have in the middle Wall Street in blue. And this is all part of the same, and it's not a great deal of distance. I haven't measured it. There might be something to measure from East Houston Street, which is the top of the Bowery, of the Coldwater Flats, right down to Battery Park. It's not a long distance, but between those 2 points is a vast difference. In 1966, not so much now, because the Bowery is now one of the most plush areas in New York City. But in 1966, it was anything but that. But between these 2 points is, in fact, this difference of contrast between the wealthy and the poor. And it was something that MacCaig was aware of. Here in 1967 is MacCaig talking about violence in the New York that he had encountered.
Last year, I've been here once before, and last year I was in New York for a wee while and I produced some poems. This one is called Hotel Room 12th Floor. New York terrified me, but it actually terrified me.
And when he comes to introduce later this last night in New York, he referenced again this whole idea of violence.
I'll finish with one which I called Last Night in New York, meaning my last night in New York. I told you it terrified me. I thought Edinburgh, which is getting, with Edinburgh people, a reputation for having ferocious traffic, it's a glade in a wood compared with
introduction which I do want to make is a CC. because a CC in my mind links very closely. It is so well worth looking at the sun comes to Earth in the Bowery, because they are just so easily connected, at least in my mind they are thematically, that his introduction to a CC makes some sense.
Another gruesome thing I saw, I suppose the least travelled man in Western Europe. It takes Americans to dig me out of my plush-lined rut. But I was once in Italy, and I visited Assisi, which some of you, no doubt all of you have seen. A sort of Christmas cake of churches, you know, 3 tiers of them to St. Francis. Struck me as a bit odd, considering he was supposed to be a brother of the poor. And at the entry to the sort of quadrangle, campus, whatever they call it, piazza, there was a poor beggar, the most pathetic-looking creature ever I saw in my life. Terrible, and everything was terrible about him except he had the sweetest expression on his face and in his voice. The poem is called Assisi. All my titles are extremely practical.
And I'll finish with these recordings with his reading of this last poem, the last of the New York poems, his last night in New York. It captured the imagination of the American audience, because he commented about something which Americans are very familiar with and very proud of: the idea of size, the idea of the skyscrapers, etc. And MacCaig raises this whole issue and compares it to what he's used to in Edinburgh.
A fortnight is long enough to live on a roller coaster. Princes Street, Edinburgh, even in the most rushed of rushed hours, I'll be there looking for violets. I'll wrap myself in your cool rusticity. I'll foretell the weather. I'll be a hick in the sticks. The sun goes up on Edinburgh. Manhattan goes up on the sun. Our buildings... Our buildings overtop Arthur's Seat, that's a hill in Edinburgh. We have a tiny little duodecimal hill in the middle of Edinburgh. Our buildings overtop Arthur's Seat and are out of date as soon as a newspaper. Last year's artist is a caveman. Tomorrow's bestseller is still to be born. I plunge through constellations and basements. My brain spins up there, I pass it on its way down. I can't see for the skyscraper in the eye, there's a traffic jam in my ears. My hands are tacky with steering my bolting self through unlikelihoods and impossibilities. Flags and circuses orbit my head, I am haloed but not saintly, poor Faust in 42nd Street. The tugs in the East River butt rafts of freight trucks through my veins. I look at my watch and its face is Times Square, glittering and crawling with invitations. 2 weeks on a roller coaster is long enough. I remember all islands are not called Coney. I think tomorrow my head will be higher than my feet. My brain will come home. I'll be able to catch up on myself. And tilting my halo, I walk out into exploding precincts and street bursts.
So all of this is described in this booklet in great detail, and the movies and the audio clips are embedded in the PDF. It's an interactive PDF. So if this is something you feel is of interest to you, you'd like to purchase, it's $5.99 and you're very welcome to do so. I hope this has been of use to you.